An 8-year-old boy with a broken leg guided his little sister through miles of wilderness after their foster father abandoned them in the forest. When a fisherman discovered them and heard what happened, the boy's whispered revelation made him immediately dial 911. Before we dive into the story, let me know where you're watching from today, and if you believe in the power of listening to children's voices, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Ethan Mitchell woke to the sound of a blue jay calling from a nearby pine. Its sharp cries matched the throbbing in his right leg. Morning sunlight filtered through the crude shelter of cedar branches he'd constructed the previous evening. For a moment, foggy confusion clouded his thoughts as he tried to remember where he was. Then reality flooded back. The forest, the long journey ahead, the immense responsibility weighing on his 8-year-old shoulders. Beside him, curled into a tight ball, his 5-year-old sister Sophie slept with her thumb loosely tucked between chapped lips, mud smudged across her cheeks. Her honey-brown hair lay tangled around her face, twigs and forest debris caught in the waves. Ethan reached out with his good hand to brush a leaf from her forehead, careful not to wake her. These precious moments while she slept were the only ones when he allowed his face to reveal fear. "We'll be all right," he whispered, more to reassure himself than his sleeping sister. "We'll find someone today." The events of the previous day replayed in his mind like a recurring nightmare. Victor's special surprise camping trip that had begun with unusual smiles and treats for Candy. The drive that grew longer and more silent as Victor's mood darkened. The sudden stop on a fire access road. Victor ordering them out of the SUV with their small backpacks containing little more than a change of clothes and a shared water bottle. The moment when Victor looked at them with cold eyes and said, "This is where trash belongs, in the wilderness," the sound of tires on gravel growing fainter as the red tail lights disappeared around the bend, leaving them alone as darkness approached. Ethan shifted his position, wincing as pain shot through his broken leg. The dish towel Victor's wife Allison had wrapped around it 4 days ago was filthy now, stained with dirt and what might be blood. He knew from the way it hurt, a deep pulsing ache that occasionally flared into something sharper, that something was very wrong with it, but he couldn't dwell on that now. He had to focus on getting Sophie to safety. A small whimper escaped his sister's lips as she stirred in her sleep. Ethan quickly composed his face, erasing all traces of pain and fear. By the time Sophie's eyes fluttered open, he was smiling at her. "Morning sunshine," he said, using their mother's old nickname for her. Sophie blinked slowly, her green eyes so like their mother's, focusing on his face. "Ethan, is Mr. Victor coming back today?" Ethan swallowed hard, tasting the lie before he spoke it. "No, remember I told you last night? We're on an adventure, just you and me. We're going to follow the creek until we find some nice people to help us." Sophie's lower lip trembled slightly.
"I'm hungry."
"I know. Me too." Ethan reached for his small backpack with his good hand and pulled out their meager supplies. One granola bar remained, along with a water bottle that was less than half full. "We'll share this for breakfast, okay? And then we need to start walking." He broke the granola bar in half, then broke his portion in half again, sliding the larger piece back into the backpack for later. Sophie didn't notice. She took her piece and nibbled at it slowly, while Ethan held the water bottle to her lips, allowing her just a few small sips. "We need to save some," he explained when she protested. "We might need it later." While Sophie finished her food, Ethan crawled out of their shelter and stood surveying their surroundings in the crisp morning light. The Oregon forest stretched in every direction, a seemingly endless expanse of pine, cedar, and fir trees. The early November air bit at his exposed skin, the autumn chill more pronounced than it had been yesterday. He could hear the gentle gurgle of the small creek nearby, the one he'd found just before darkness had fallen completely. Last night, he'd made the decision to follow it, remembering something he'd seen on a nature program at one of their previous foster homes. "Water leads to civilization," the narrator had said. That simple fact had become their only hope. Ethan bent down and looked back into the shelter. "Time to go, Sophie. We need to walk as far as we can before it gets dark again." Sophie crawled out, her purple sneakers, once pink but now stained with mud and pine sap, appearing first. She stood beside him, her small hand automatically seeking his. He let her hold onto his left hand, keeping his injured right leg as still as possible. "Do you think we'll find Mom today?" Sophie asked, her voice small but hopeful. The question pierced Ethan's heart. Their mother had been gone for 2 years now, but Sophie still asked about her sometimes, especially when she was scared. She'd been only 3 when they found their mother unresponsive on the bathroom floor, the needle still in her arm. Ethan had been 6, old enough to understand that something terrible had happened but not old enough to know what to do except call 911, a number their mother had made him memorize just in case. "No, sunshine," he said gently. "Mom's in heaven, remember? But maybe we'll find someone nice who can help us." As they began walking along the creek bank, Ethan's mind drifted back to the first of the foster homes they'd been placed in after their mother's death. The Andersons had been kind enough, with 2 children of their own and another foster child, a teenager named Carlos who taught Ethan how to play chess. They'd stayed there for 5 months before Mrs. Anderson's mother became ill, and the social worker explained they couldn't take Ethan and Sophie with them to Florida because of jurisdictional issues. After that came the Fosters, where Mrs. Foster made pancakes every Sunday, but Mr. Foster drank too much and yelled at night. Then the Simpsons, where they'd been separated, Sophie going to a special placement for younger children until Ethan had refused to eat for 4 days straight, and they'd been reunited. 2 more homes followed, each one a blur of new rules, new faces, new disappointments. And then 7 weeks ago, they'd been placed with Victor and Allison Reynolds. "You're going to love it there." Their new social worker, a harried woman named Ms. Parker, who'd replaced Ms. Johnson 3 months earlier, had told them. "The Reynolds have a spacious house in the country. No other children, so you'll get all their attention at first." It had seemed promising. The house was indeed big, a modern ranch-style home set on several acres outside a small Oregon town. Allison had shown them their rooms, separate but adjoining, with new clothes in the drawers and a stuffed rabbit waiting on Sophie's bed. There was a rope swing in the backyard and a vegetable garden where Allison let them pick snap peas right off the vine. Victor had seemed nice too in the beginning. He worked from home in finance, though Ethan never quite understood what that meant. He'd take breaks during the day to kick a soccer ball with Ethan in the yard or to drive them all into town for ice cream. He called Ethan Buddy and ruffled his hair, telling Allison how well he'd chosen this time. But there were signs, small ones at first, that Ethan had learned to recognize from their previous foster homes. The way Allison would tense slightly when Victor's voice rose, the careful attention she paid to keeping the house exactly as he liked it, the dinners where Victor would suddenly find fault with something, the meat too rare, the potatoes undercooked, and Allison would apologize profusely while the children sat in silence, eyes on their plates. 3 weeks in, the mask began to slip. It started with Victor snapping at Sophie for spilling juice at breakfast, his face flushing with a rage that seemed out of proportion to the offense. Ethan had quickly grabbed a paper towel and cleaned it up, apologizing for his sister while Allison stood frozen by the sink, her knuckles white against the counter's edge. After that, Victor's temper emerged more frequently. He never hit them, he was too careful for that. But his anger filled the house like a thundercloud, unpredictable and terrifying. Ethan learned to read the signs. The tightening around Victor's mouth, the way his fingers would drum against a tabletop, the sudden silences that meant they should make themselves scarce. Allison would sometimes try to intervene, suggesting that Victor take a drive to clear his head or offering to take the children out for a while. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't, and the argument would continue behind closed doors. Victor's voice a low, threatening rumble, Allison's responses too quiet to make out. The day Ethan's leg was broken had begun like any other. He'd been in the backyard with Sophie, who was drawing with sidewalk chalk on the concrete patio, while Ethan bounced a tennis ball against the side of the garage. Buck, the Reynolds' aging chocolate lab, dozed in a patch of autumn sunlight nearby. Victor had been on the phone in his office, the window open to catch the last warm day of the season. Ethan could hear his voice growing progressively louder, angrier. When the back door slammed open, Ethan instinctively moved closer to Sophie. Victor stalked across the yard, his face contorted with a fury Ethan had never seen before. not even in their worst foster homes. He wasn't seeing them, Ethan realized. They were simply in the path of his rage. When Victor drew back his foot to kick the dozing buck, Ethan reacted without thinking. He'd thrown himself forward, placing his body between the dog and Victor's boot. The kick meant for Buck's ribs connected with Ethan's outstretched leg instead, the crack audible in the sudden silence of the yard. For a moment, everyone froze. Ethan on the ground, clutching his leg, Sophie wide-eyed and silent, Victor standing over them, his rage giving way to something like shock. Then Allison was there, rushing from the house, her face pale as she gathered Ethan into her arms and hurried him inside. Later, after Allison had wrapped his leg with a dish towel and bound it with duct tape, assuring him it was just a bad sprain even as tears gathered in her eyes, Ethan had overheard them arguing in the kitchen. "We need to take him to a doctor, Victor. His leg could be broken. And tell them what? That I kicked him? Do you know what would happen? We could say he fell off the rope swing. Accidents happen to kids all the time. They'll ask questions. They always do. That new social worker already doesn't like me. One whiff of trouble and they'll take the kids. Open an investigation. But his leg is fine. Kids are resilient. Give him some children's Tylenol. It'll heal on its own." They'd spent the next 4 days in a strange limbo. Victor was solicitous, almost gentle, bringing Ethan popsicles and letting him watch extra TV. Allison hovered anxiously, changing the makeshift bandage and checking his toes for circulation. No one mentioned a doctor again. And then yesterday morning, Victor had announced the special surprise camping trip. Just the 3 of them. Victor, Ethan, and Sophie. Allison would stay home because someone has to look after Buck. Ethan had seen the fear in Allison's eyes, had felt it mirror his own, but neither of them had dared object.
Ethan, I'm tired.
"Can we rest?" Sophie's voice pulled him back to the present. They'd been walking for at least an hour, maybe longer. The creek had widened slightly but was still small enough to jump across in places. Ethan had been careful to keep it in sight, even when the terrain forced them away from the bank. "Just a little bit longer," he encouraged, even though his own legs were heavy with fatigue and his leg throbbed mercilessly. "See that big rock up ahead? We'll rest there." The big rock was actually a boulder, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Ethan helped Sophie climb up, then sat beside her. His legs dangled over the edge. From this vantage point, he could see farther down the creek. There was no sign of a road or a house, just more trees stretching into the distance. Sophie leaned against his good side, her small body warm against his. "Tell me a story, Ethan. Tell me about the Wonder House." The Wonder House was a story Ethan had invented during their second foster home, when Sophie would cry for their mother at night. It was a house that transformed to reflect whatever its inhabitants needed. Windows that looked out onto oceans or mountains depending on what you wanted to see. Rooms that expanded to accommodate friends. A kitchen that always smelled of cookies baking. "The Wonder House is waiting for us," Ethan began, his voice low and steady despite his exhaustion. "It's not far now. The creek will lead us right to it. And when we get there, the front door will recognize us and swing open wide." As he spun the familiar tale, embellishing it with new details, he imagined a garden where blueberries grew all year round, a playroom with every toy imaginable. He scanned the woods around them. The November sun was climbing higher, but the air remained cool under the dense canopy of trees. He needed to keep them moving. They had already spent one night in the woods, and he wasn't sure they could survive another. "Time to go, sunshine," he said when he'd finished the story. "The Wonder House is waiting." Getting Sophie down from the boulder was harder than helping her up. When she jumped the short distance to the ground, she landed awkwardly and scraped her palm on a sharp stone. "Ow!" she cried, tears welling in her eyes as she held up her hand to show him the small cut. "It's okay," Ethan said, kneeling beside her. He pulled the water bottle from his backpack and poured a tiny amount over the scrape to clean it. "See? Just a little scratch. You're brave like Mom always said." The mention of their mother seemed to help. Sophie sniffled but stopped crying, allowing Ethan to gently wipe her hand dry on his shirt. "We need to be careful with our water," he explained as he put the bottle away. "We can get more from the creek, but I'm not sure if it's okay to drink." Another fragment of knowledge from a nature show. Wild water might make you sick unless you boil it, but they had no way to make a fire, no container that could withstand heat. They continued their journey alongside the creek, Ethan constantly scanning for signs of civilization. A trail, a cabin, anything. As the day wore on, clouds began to gather overhead, the sunlight fading. The air grew colder, and Ethan noticed Sophie shivering in her light jacket. "Are you cold, Sophie?" She nodded, her lips pressed together to keep her teeth from chattering. Ethan stopped and shrugged off his own jacket, a fleece one with a waterproof shell that Allison had bought him just 2 weeks ago. Putting it around Sophie's shoulders was awkward with his injured leg, but he managed. "What about you?" Sophie asked, even as she snuggled into the warmth of his jacket. "I'm not cold," Ethan lied, already feeling the bite of the wind through his thin, long-sleeved shirt. "Come on, we need to keep moving by mid-afternoon." The clouds had thickened, and a fine mist began to fall. Ethan's spirits sank as he realized they were in for a damp, cold night if they didn't find shelter soon. Sophie was flagging, her steps slowing despite his constant encouragement. "I can't walk anymore," she finally said, stopping in her tracks. "My feet hurt."
I'm hungry.
"I want to go home." The despair in her voice nearly broke him. They had no home, not really. Just a series of houses where they'd been temporary guests at best, unwanted burdens at worst. "I know, sunshine. I know it's hard, but we have to keep going." When she shook her head, tears mingling with the mist on her cheeks, Ethan made a decision. He knelt down in front of her, his back to her. "Climb on," he said. "I'll carry you for a while." "But your leg," she said, her voice small with worry. "It's fine," he said, using the same dismissive tone Victor had used with Allison. "Come on, it's getting late, and we need to find a place to sleep." Sophie hesitated, then climbed onto his back, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Ethan gritted his teeth against the pain as he stood, adjusting her weight to minimize pressure on his broken leg. She was light for a 5-year-old, but still, every step sent jolts of agony through his injured limb. He walked on, one foot in front of the other, focusing on the sound of the creek to his left, on Sophie's soft breathing against his ear, on anything but the pain. The mist thickened into a light rain, soaking through his shirt, but the jacket he'd given Sophie kept her relatively dry. As the daylight began to fade, Ethan finally spotted what he'd been searching for. A small clearing beneath a stand of cedar trees. The ground there would be drier, the dense branches providing some protection from the rain. He carried Sophie to the spot and gently set her down. "We'll stay here tonight," he said, trying to sound confident. "I'll make us a shelter like I did yesterday," using his good leg and, when necessary, his hands. Ethan gathered fallen branches and cedar boughs, arranging them against a low-hanging branch to create a crude lean-to. The work exhausted him, but he pushed on, knowing that staying dry through the night was critical. When the shelter was finished, he coaxed Sophie inside and gave her the remaining portion of his granola bar along with a few carefully measured sips of water. The last light was fading from the sky, and with it, Ethan's hope that someone would find them before nightfall. "Are we going to be okay, Ethan?" Sophie asked, her voice small in the gathering darkness. Ethan lay down beside her, positioning himself between her and the shelter's opening. "Yes," he said firmly. "We're going to be fine. Tomorrow, we'll keep following the creek, and we'll find people who will help us. Promise." "I promise, sunshine." And in that moment, despite everything, he believed it. He had to. Outside their shelter, the rain fell steadily, its gentle patter against the cedar boughs almost soothing. Ethan pulled Sophie close, sharing what warmth he could. She fell asleep quickly, exhausted from their long day. But Ethan remained awake, listening to the night sounds of the forest and fighting against his own fatigue. He thought of their mother, of her warm green eyes, Sophie's eyes, and her laugh that could fill a room. Of the good days when she'd been clean, when she'd make French toast shaped like stars and take them to the park. Of her whispered promise the last time the social worker had come to check on them. Her arms wrapped around them both. "It's going to get better, I promise. I'm trying so hard for you both." She hadn't been able to keep that promise. The pull of opioids had been stronger than her love for them. Though Ethan never doubted she had loved them, it was why he had to be strong now, why he had to get Sophie to safety. He'd promised his mother once, as she lay sleeping on the couch, that he would always take care of his little sister. It was the one promise he intended to keep. In the darkness of the Oregon forest, rain seeping through their makeshift shelter and pain radiating from his broken leg, 8-year-old Ethan Mitchell finally allowed himself a single silent tear. Then, pulling Sophie closer, he closed his eyes and surrendered to a fitful sleep. Miles away in the Reynolds house, Allison sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. The house was silent. Victor had left hours ago, taking most of their savings and leaving her with a warning not to call anyone if she knew what was good for her. But as the clock ticked past midnight and the rain continued to fall, Allison reached for the phone. Her hand trembled as she dialed, but her voice was steady when the dispatcher answered. "I need to report 2 missing children," she said. "Please hurry. They're out there alone in the forest." Morning came with reluctant fingers of light penetrating the cedar boughs of their shelter. Ethan woke first, his body stiff and chilled, his broken leg a constant throbbing presence. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, but everything remained damp. Their clothes, the ground beneath them, the very air they breathed. For a moment, he lay still, listening to Sophie's soft breathing beside him, trying to gather strength for the day ahead. When he finally moved, pain shot through his leg with such intensity that he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. In the dim light filtering through the branches, he examined the dish towel wrapping. It had slipped during the night, revealing angry red skin beneath. Ethan didn't know much about broken bones, but he knew enough to be worried by the swelling and the heat radiating from his lower leg. He carefully readjusted the makeshift bandage, securing it as best he could with just one hand. The movement caused Sophie to stir, her small body curling closer to his warmth before her eyes fluttered open. "Morning already?" she mumbled, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Yeah, sunshine. The rain stopped. That's good, right?" She nodded, sitting up and looking around their small shelter as if seeing it for the first time. "I'm really hungry," Ethan, the words twisted in his chest. Their meager supplies were gone. The granola bar was finished, the water bottle nearly empty. He'd been too exhausted last night to think beyond creating shelter. But now the reality of their situation pressed down on him with crushing weight. "Me too," he admitted. "But I have an idea. Let's go look by the creek. Maybe we can find some berries or something." It was a desperate hope, but it was all he had. Ethan helped Sophie out of the shelter, noticing how she winced when she stood. Her sneakers were soaked through, and he could see a blister forming on her heel where the wet material had rubbed against her skin. The morning air was crisp and cold, their breath visible in small clouds. Ethan returned his jacket to Sophie, ignoring her protests that he should wear it. The creek gurgled nearby, slightly higher than it had been yesterday due to the rain. They made their way toward it, Ethan scanning the underbrush for anything edible. "Look!" Sophie suddenly exclaimed, pointing to a cluster of bushes near the water's edge. "Berries!" Ethan's heart leapt, then immediately plummeted as he recognized the bright red berries. "Don't touch those, Sophie. They're not good to eat." Another fragment of knowledge from a school field trip. Red berries in clusters were often poisonous. The naturalist who'd led their class through a national park had pointed them out, warning the children to never eat wild berries unless an adult identified them as safe. Disappointment clouded Sophie's face, but she obediently stepped back from the bush. They continued along the creek, both scanning for anything edible. After nearly 20 minutes of searching, Ethan spotted what he was looking for. A salmonberry bush, its orange-red fruit glistening with morning dew. "These are okay," he said, relief washing through him as he recognized the distinctive shape. "I've seen these at the farmer's market. They're salmonberries, They picked the ripe berries eagerly. Their fingers soon stained with juice. There weren't many. It was late in the season, but each tiny fruit was a burst of tartness that temporarily quieted the gnawing in their stomachs. While they ate, Ethan formulated a plan for the day. They would continue following the creek, which seemed to be widening as they traveled. That had to be a good sign, didn't it? Larger creeks led to rivers, and rivers led to towns. At least he hoped they did. "Ready to go?" he asked when the last berry was gone. "We need to walk as far as we can today," Sophie nodded solemnly, but he could see the fatigue already present in her small face. Her usual boundless energy had been sapped by hunger, cold, and fear. Still, she took his hand without complaint as they set off once more, the creek their only guide in the wilderness. The day progressed slowly, marked by brief rests and increasingly difficult terrain. The land began to slope downward, forcing them to navigate around fallen trees and over slippery rocks. Ethan's leg protested with every jarring step, but he kept his pain hidden from Sophie, distracting her with stories and games whenever she began to flag. "Let's play I Spy," he suggested during one of their rest periods. "I'll go first. I spy with my little eye something green." Sophie looked around at the forest surrounding them, a small smile forming despite her exhaustion. "That's everything, Ethan." "Nope, just one specific green thing. You have to guess which 1 inch. That big fern over there?" "No, try again." The game continued, providing a brief respite from their situation. Ethan tried to keep his voice light to maintain the pretense that this was indeed just an adventure rather than a desperate struggle for survival. But as the day wore on and Sophie grew more tired, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the facade. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had returned, and a cold drizzle began to fall. Ethan's shirt, which had almost dried during the morning hours, was quickly soaked through again. Sophie huddled in his jacket, but even that was beginning to let moisture seep through. "We need to find better shelter, and soon," Ethan thought. "I can't walk anymore," Sophie finally said, stopping in her tracks. Her face was pale beneath the dirt smudges, her lips tinged with blue from the cold. Without hesitation, Ethan knelt down, presenting his back to her. "Climb on. I'll carry you for a while." "But your leg," she insisted, though they both knew it was serious. "Come on, sunshine. We need to keep moving." Sophie climbed onto his back, her arms loose around his neck. Ethan stood carefully, adjusting her weight as best he could to minimize pressure on his broken leg. Even so, each step sent spikes of agony through him, and he had to force himself to keep putting one foot in front of the other. The creek had widened significantly now, becoming a proper stream with a stronger current. The rain made the ground slippery, and twice Ethan nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment to prevent them both from tumbling down the increasingly steep bank. His vision occasionally blurred. Whether from pain, exhaustion, or the beginning of fever, he couldn't tell. Just when he felt he couldn't go any farther, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing beside the stream. In the center stood what looked like an abandoned fishing hut, a small wooden structure raised on stilts with walls on 3 sides and a partial roof. It wasn't much, but it was better than anything they'd had since being left in the woods. "Look, Sophie," Ethan said, his voice strained. "A little cabin. We can stay there tonight." He set Sophie down carefully, then examined the structure. The wooden ladder leading up to the platform was rotted in places but still usable. Inside, the floor was relatively dry, protected from the rain by the remains of the roof. It would be cold, with one wall completely open to the elements, but at least they'd be off the ground and partially sheltered. "I'll go up first," Ethan said, testing the ladder with his weight. "Then I'll help you up." Climbing one-handed was difficult, but he managed to reach the platform. Once there, he turned and called down to Sophie, guiding her up each rung of the ladder until she scrambled onto the platform beside him. The small space, about 6 feet square, was empty except for an old plastic bucket in one corner and a few empty soda cans that spoke of occasional human presence. Ethan kicked the cans aside and helped Sophie get settled in the driest corner. "We'll stay here tonight," he said, trying to sound confident. "Tomorrow we'll keep following the creek." I think we're getting closer to finding people. In truth, he had no idea if they were any closer to rescue than they had been yesterday. The Oregon wilderness seemed endless, the trees stretching in every direction with no sign of roads or houses or anything remotely civilized. But he couldn't let Sophie see his doubt. The light was fading rapidly now, the cloudy sky hastening nightfall. Ethan took stock of their situation. No food, almost no water, wet clothes, and temperatures that would likely drop further after dark. And his leg. He didn't want to think about his leg, about the deep pulsing ache that occasionally sharpened into something so intense it momentarily stole his breath. "I'm cold, Ethan," Sophie said, her teeth chattering. "And my tummy hurts." Ethan sat beside her, wrapping his good arm around her shoulders and pulling her close. "I know, sunshine. Mine too. But we'll be okay. Remember what Mom used to say. Mitchells are as tough as they come." Sophie nodded against his shoulder. The familiar saying brought a lump to Ethan's throat. Their mother, for all her failures, had loved them fiercely. On her good days, she'd been full of these little sayings, affirmations of their strength, their resilience, their worth. Ethan clung to them now, using them to bolster his failing courage. "Tell me about the Wonder House again," Sophie requested, her voice small in the gathering darkness. Ethan began the familiar tale, embellishing it with new details. A fireplace that lit itself when you were cold, beds with the softest blankets imaginable, a pantry that was always stocked with their favorite foods. As he spoke, he could almost feel the phantom warmth of the imaginary fire, could almost taste the hot chocolate and cookies he described. Sophie fell asleep before the story was finished, exhaustion finally claiming her. Ethan continued to hold her, listening to the rain pattering on the partial roof above them and the creek rushing below. He was so tired, his body aching with a bone-deep weariness that made his eyelids heavy. But he fought against sleep, afraid of what might happen if he surrendered to it. His thoughts turned to the search that must be underway by now. Surely Allison had called someone, had told them about Victor abandoning the children in the woods. But would they know where to look? The fire access road where Victor had left them was miles from any main highway, and they'd been walking for nearly 2 days now. How would anyone find them in this vast wilderness? The rain increased, driven by a rising wind that cut through their wet clothes like knives. Ethan pulled Sophie closer, trying to shield her from the worst of it. His broken leg throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and he could feel heat radiating from it despite the cold air. An infection, probably. He remembered a girl at one of their foster homes who'd broken her arm falling from a swing and broken her elbow. The foster parents had taken her to the hospital immediately, and even with proper medical care, she developed an infection that required antibiotics. Ethan had no antibiotics, no proper care, nothing but his own determination to keep Sophie safe, and that determination was being tested to its limits as pain and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. He must have dozed off despite his efforts because the next thing he knew, he was jerking awake to the sound of Sophie's voice. "Ethan, Ethan, there's something out there." Instantly alert, Ethan strained to hear through the sound of rain and wind. At first, he caught nothing unusual, but then a snuffling noise and branches breaking beneath heavy footsteps. Something was moving in the underbrush below their shelter. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. A bear? A mountain lion? He had no idea what kinds of predators roamed the Oregon woods, but he was suddenly acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. 2 small children with no weapons, no way to defend themselves. "Shoo!" he whispered to Sophie, who was clutching his arm in terror. "It's okay. We're up high. They can't get to us." He hoped that was true. The fishing hut was elevated about 6 feet off the ground, presumably to give fishermen a better vantage point and to keep them dry during high water. But would that height deter a determined predator? The sounds grew louder, closer. Ethan pulled Sophie behind him, positioning himself between her and the open side of the hut. If something tried to climb up, it would have to get through him first. A shadow moved at the base of the hut, visible even in the dim light. Ethan held his breath, every muscle tensed. He couldn't fight, couldn't run. All he could do was wait and pray that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. The creature emerged from the underbrush into a small patch of moonlight, and Ethan nearly collapsed with relief. It wasn't a bear or a mountain lion, but a raccoon. Its masked face tilted up toward them curiously. The animal sniffed the air, apparently caught the scent of humans, and decided they weren't worth investigating further. It ambled off into the darkness, leaving only the sound of the rain once more. "It's gone," Ethan said, feeling Sophie's small body still trembling against his back. "It was just a raccoon, like in that book we read. Remember Rocky Raccoon's Midnight Adventure?" Sophie peeked around him, her eyes wide. "Are you sure it's gone?" "I'm sure. Raccoons don't bother people. He was probably just looking for food." The mention of food made Ethan's stomach clench painfully. They hadn't eaten anything since the salmonberries that morning, and even those had been a meager breakfast. Tomorrow they would need to find more food, or he pushed the thought away they would find food. They would find people. They had to. The rest of the night passed in fitful snatches of sleep, interrupted by rain, cold, and pain. Ethan's leg had gone from throbbing to a relentless burning sensation that radiated up to his hip and down to his toes. He tried to check it in the darkness but could only feel that the swelling had increased, stretching the dirty dish towel to its limits. By the time gray light began to filter through the trees again, Ethan felt worse than he had the previous morning. His head pounded, and his body alternated between chills and waves of heat that had nothing to do with the external temperature. But Sophie was looking at him with trust in her green eyes, and so he forced himself to smile, to act as if everything was normal. "Ready for another adventure day?" he asked, his voice surprisingly upbeat. Sophie nodded, though without enthusiasm. "I'm really hungry, Ethan, and thirsty." Their water bottle was empty now. Ethan had given Sophie the last few sips before she'd fallen asleep. "We'll drink from the creek," he decided, though he wasn't sure if that was safe. But dehydration was a more immediate danger than whatever might be in the water. They descended the ladder carefully, Ethan going first to catch Sophie if she slipped. The morning was cool but clearer than it had been the previous day, the rain having moved on during the night. The creek rushed past, swollen from the rainfall, its current stronger than before. Ethan led Sophie to the edge, where they both cupped water in their hands and drank thirstily. The water was cold and tasted of earth and minerals, but it was the most refreshing thing Ethan had ever experienced. They filled their bottle as well, though drinking directly from the creek was easier than trying to fill the narrowmouth container with just one hand. "Now we need to find some breakfast," Ethan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Let's look for more berries while we walk." They set off along the creek bank, both scanning for anything edible. The terrain continued to slope downward, the path alongside the water becoming increasingly treacherous. In places, they had to climb over fallen trees or navigate around sections where the bank had eroded, leaving nothing but a steep drop to the rushing water below. Ethan's condition deteriorated as the morning wore on. The fever that had been threatening now took hold in earnest, making his movements clumsy and his thoughts sluggish. Several times he had to stop and lean against a tree, waiting for a wave of dizziness to pass. He tried to hide it from Sophie, but she was becoming increasingly concerned. "You don't look good, Ethan," she said during one of these stops, her small face pinched with worry. "Your cheeks are all red, but you're shivering."
"I'm okay," Ethan insisted.
Just a little tired, he pushed himself away from the tree trunk, determined to keep moving. They had to find help soon. He could feel his strength ebbing with each passing hour. By early afternoon, they came to a place where the creek joined a larger stream, the two waterways merging in a small series of rapids. The sound of rushing water filled the air, drowning out the birds and the whisper of wind through the trees. The path they'd been following disappeared, the bank too steep and rocky to traverse safely. Ethan stood swaying slightly, trying to decide which way to go. His thoughts felt thick and slow, like trying to wade through mud. "We need to cross here," he finally decided, spotting a series of partially submerged rocks that created a potential path across the swollen creek. "Be very careful, Sophie. The rocks might be slippery." Sophie looked at the rushing water with apprehension.
I'm scared, Ethan.
It looks fast. I know, but we need to get to the other side. I'll go first and then help you. Okay? Ethan stepped carefully onto the first rock, testing it before putting his full weight down. The rock held firm, though it was indeed slippery. He moved to the second, then the third, his good leg taking most of his weight, his broken one barely touching down. Halfway across, he turned and gestured for Sophie to follow. Come on, sunshine. Just step where I stepped. Sophie hesitated, then began to make her way across, her small face a mask of concentration. She made it to the third rock, the same one Ethan stood on, and clutched his hand tightly. You're doing great, he encouraged. Just a few more to go. They continued their precarious crossing, Ethan moving to the next rock and then helping Sophie follow. They were nearly to the other side when it happened. Ethan's vision blurred suddenly, the fever making his balance uncertain. He swayed, his injured leg hitting the rock hard as he tried to steady himself. The pain was blinding, and for a moment, the world went gray around the edges. He heard Sophie cry out, felt her hand slip from his, and then she was gone, swept away by the current. Sophie! The scream tore from Ethan's throat as he saw his sister's small form being carried downstream. Without thinking, he threw himself into the water, ignoring the explosion of agony from his leg as he struck out after her. The creek was shockingly cold, the current stronger than it had appeared from the bank. It pulled at him, trying to push him under, but Ethan fought with every ounce of strength he had left. Sophie's head was just visible above the surface, her arms flailing as she tried to keep afloat. I'm coming, he shouted, though the roar of the water likely drowned his words. Hold on. Swimming with a broken leg was nearly impossible, but Ethan kicked with his good leg and pulled with his arms, slowly gaining on Sophie. The current had taken them around a bend, the fishing hut now out of sight behind them. Sophie managed to grab onto a branch that hung low over the water, temporarily halting her progress downstream. Hang on, Ethan called, swimming with renewed determination. He reached her just as her grip on the branch began to slip, grabbing her jacket with one hand while clutching at the branch with the other. With monumental effort, he pulled them both toward the shore, fighting the current every inch of the way. When his feet finally touched the rocky bottom, he used his last reserves of strength to drag Sophie onto the bank, both of them collapsing in a heap on the wet stones. For several minutes, they lay there, coughing and gasping for breath. Ethan's entire body trembled with cold and exhaustion, his leg a mass of white-hot pain. Sophie's teeth chattered uncontrollably as she curled against him, seeking warmth they no longer had to share. Their clothes were soaked, the temperature dropping as afternoon began to fade into evening. Ethan knew with terrible clarity that they were in serious trouble. The swim had depleted what little energy they had left, and the wet clothes in the cooling air would quickly lead to hypothermia. They needed shelter, warmth, help, and they needed it now. We have to move, he managed through chattering teeth. Find shelter. Sophie nodded against his shoulder, clearly too exhausted and frightened to speak. With tremendous effort, Ethan pushed himself to a sitting position, then to his feet, pulling Sophie up beside him. The world tilted alarmingly, his vision fading in and out as the fever, pain, and cold warred for dominance in his failing body. Just a little farther, he whispered, though he had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other. They stumbled along the bank, Ethan leaning heavily on Sophie now, their roles reversed by his deteriorating condition. The light was fading rapidly, the forest growing darker, more threatening. Eventually, they reached a small clearing where the creek narrowed and deepened, forming a pool before continuing downstream. On the far side, a steep bank rose about 10 feet, the top lined with tall pines. Something about the landscape seemed different, more managed somehow. Ethan squinted through the gathering darkness, trying to focus his fever-clouded vision. There, at the top of the bank, was that a path? A real trail, not just an animal track? Hope flared briefly, giving him one last surge of energy. Look, Sophie, he croaked, his voice nearly gone. "I think there's a trail up there. People use trails. If we can just get up the bank." Sophie followed his gaze, her green eyes widening with renewed hope. "I see it. It looks like a real path." The bank was steep, the soil loose and crumbling in places. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a challenging climb. In their current state, wet, exhausted, Ethan barely conscious with fever, it seemed nearly impossible. But they had come so far, survived so much. They couldn't give up now, not when help might be just on the other side of that rise. "You go first," Ethan said, giving Sophie a gentle push toward the slope. "I'll follow." Sophie began to climb, her small hands grasping at roots and rocks, her feet slipping occasionally in the loose soil. Ethan followed more slowly, his movements clumsy, each shift of his broken leg sending fresh waves of agony through him. Halfway up, Sophie's foot dislodged a small cascade of pebbles that rained down on Ethan's face. He blinked them away, losing his grip momentarily before regaining it.
"Sophie,"
Sophie called down, looking back with concern. "Keep going," Ethan urged, his voice barely above a whisper now. Almost there. When Sophie reached the top, she immediately turned and extended her hand down to Ethan. He was only a few feet from the edge, but those last few feet seemed like miles. His strength was gone, his body responding sluggishly to his commands. With Sophie's help, he dragged himself over the edge, rolling onto his back on the relatively flat ground at the top of the bank. The sky wheeled overhead, stars just beginning to appear as the last light faded. "We made it," Sophie said, her voice quavering with exhaustion and relief. "And look, Ethan, it is a real trail." Ethan turned his head to see a clearly defined path cutting through the trees, wide enough for a vehicle of some kind. Whether it was a hiking trail, a fire road, or a path to someone's property, he couldn't tell, but it was undeniably human-made. They had found civilization, or at least a route that would eventually lead to it. "Which way should we go?" Sophie asked, peering down the path in both directions. It disappeared into darkness whether they looked left or right. Ethan tried to think, to make one last good decision, but his mind was foggy, his thoughts disconnected. "Right," he said finally, for no reason other than it was the side of the path nearest the creek, and the water had been their guide for so long. "Go right." They stumbled along the path, Ethan leaning heavily on Sophie now, his good leg dragging, his broken one barely touching the ground. The night closed in around them, the temperature dropping further. Ethan could feel consciousness slipping away, darkness encroaching on the edges of his vision. He fought to stay awake, to keep moving, but his body had reached its limit. "Sophie," he managed, his voice a threadbare whisper, "I need to rest. Just for a minute." He sank to the ground at the edge of the path, pulling Sophie down beside him. The earth was cold beneath them, but he no longer had the strength to care. Sophie curled against him, her small body trembling with cold and fear. "Just a short rest," he promised, though he could feel himself drifting, his mind detaching from the pain and fear and responsibility that had driven him for so long. "Then we'll keep going." "Ethan," Sophie's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Ethan, don't go to sleep. Please don't. I'm scared." He tried to respond, to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. The darkness was too inviting, too complete. His last conscious thought was of their mother, her green eyes so like Sophie's, her voice whispering that she was proud of him, that he'd done well, that he could rest now. Miles away, in a small ranger station at the edge of the Willamette National Forest, a group gathered around a map spread out on a table. State police, forest rangers, and local search and rescue volunteers listened as a detective pointed to a fire access road deep in the woods. "According to Mrs. Reynolds, this is approximately where her husband left the children 3 days ago," the detective said, his finger tapping a spot on the map. "Since then, we believe they've been following this watershed system downstream. The boy apparently knows that water leads to civilization." "Smart kid," one of the rangers commented. "But that's a lot of ground to cover. And with the rain we've had." "We'll find them," the detective said firmly. At first light tomorrow, we'll have helicopters in the air and teams on the ground. Every available officer, every volunteer. These kids have been out there for 3 days with minimal supplies. Time is critical. In another room, Allison Reynolds sat with her head in her hands, a barely touched cup of coffee on the table before her. The weight of her delayed action, her failure to call for help immediately, pressed down on her like a physical force. "Please," she whispered to no one in particular. "Please find them. Please let them be alive." Back in the forest, beneath the protective canopy of pine trees, Ethan Mitchell burned with fever, his broken leg hot and swollen beneath its dirty bandage. Beside him, Sophie slept the exhausted sleep of a child who had walked beyond her endurance, who had faced fear, hunger, and cold with a courage beyond her years. And somewhere in the darkness, the beam of a flashlight swept through the trees as Thomas Bennett, a local fisherman checking his equipment before the coming storm, made his way along the forest trail. He hadn't heard about the missing children yet. He'd been at his remote cabin since early morning. But he would soon become an unlikely hero in a story that would capture the hearts of an entire state. For now, though, he was simply a man walking through the forest, unaware that less than a quarter-mile ahead, 2 children huddled against a fallen log, one of them barely clinging to consciousness, both of them desperately in need of the help he could provide. The night deepened, stars wheeled overhead, and the creek continued its journey toward the valley, carrying with it the promise of civilization and salvation. If only Ethan could hold on long enough to reach it. Thomas Bennett moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the easy confidence of a man who knew these woods intimately. At 48, he'd been fishing in this part of Oregon for over 3 decades, starting as a teenager tagging along behind his grandfather. The beam of his flashlight swept methodically across the forest floor, illuminating fallen leaves, exposed roots, and the occasional startled eyes of nocturnal creatures. He hadn't planned to be out quite this early, but the weather report had mentioned another storm front moving in by midday, and he wanted to check his fishing equipment at his favorite spot before the rain hit. The specialized gear was part of a study he was conducting on local trout populations for the State Conservation Department. The creek had risen considerably with the recent rainfall, its usually gentle murmur now a constant rush that provided a backdrop to the pre-dawn chorus of the forest. Thomas paused on a small rise, taking a swig from his thermos of coffee and surveying the terrain ahead. The beam of his flashlight caught something unusual, a faint trail of disturbed vegetation leading away from the main path. Something or someone had passed this way recently. A deer, perhaps, or maybe a bear. But the trail seemed too narrow, too direct. And there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Thomas had been a volunteer with the local search and rescue team for nearly 12 years. Though he hadn't been called out recently, he had a searcher's eye for anomalies in the landscape, the small signs that indicated human presence in places where humans typically didn't venture. He decided to follow the trail, curiosity drawing him forward. The path led toward a fallen log about 30 yards from the main trail. As he approached, his light caught a flash of color beneath the sweeping branches of a pine, something that didn't belong in the natural palette of the forest. Thomas moved closer, pushing aside the low-hanging pine boughs with one hand while directing his flashlight beam into the space beneath. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. 2 children lay curled together on a bed of pine needles. A little girl, no more than 5 or 6, slept with her thumb in her mouth, wrapped in what appeared to be a fleece jacket several sizes too large for her. Beside her, a boy who looked to be around 8 sat propped against the trunk of the pine. His eyes closed, his face flushed with an unnatural color that was visible even in the beam of the flashlight. For a moment, Thomas stood frozen in shock. The last thing he'd expected to find deep in these woods was a pair of children clearly alone and in distress. Then training and instinct took over. He knelt down, still keeping some distance to avoid frightening them. "Hey there," he called softly. "Can you hear me?" The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with fever. His body tensed immediately, one arm, the left one, moving protectively in front of the still sleeping girl. "It's okay," Thomas said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Thomas. I'm a fisherman. I live near here. Can you tell me your name? The boy stared at him, confusion and fear working on his face. Ethan, he finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the creek. My name's Ethan. Hi, Ethan. Is that your sister? Thomas gestured toward the sleeping child. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Sophie. Her name's Sophie. Don't wake her yet. She's really tired. Thomas noticed how Ethan kept his right leg stretched out stiffly, wrapped in what looked like a filthy dish towel. Even in the dim light, he could see the unnatural swelling, the angry redness of infection. Ethan, what happened to your leg? He asked, already suspecting the answer but needing confirmation. It's broken, Ethan said matter-of-factly, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. Mr. Victor broke it. The simple statement, delivered with such resignation, made Thomas's chest tighten with anger, but he kept his expression neutral, knowing the boy would be watching for any reaction. And who is Mr. Victor? Our foster father. He left us here. Ethan's eyes darted around, suddenly more alert despite the fever. He's not coming back. He said we were trash. That trash belongs in the forest. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd heard many stories in his years with search and rescue. People stranded after getting lost, injuries sustained during hikes or climbs gone wrong. But nothing like this. Nothing so deliberately cruel, so calculated to cause harm to children. But I'm not trash, Ethan continued, his voice stronger now, a spark of defiance cutting through the fever haze. Sophie's not trash. I promised Mom I'd always keep her safe. You did keep her safe, Ethan, Thomas said, his throat tight with emotion. You did an incredible job. But now I'm going to help you, okay? I'm going to call for people who can get you and Sophie out of these woods and to a hospital. Ethan seemed to consider this, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face as if searching for any sign of deception. Finally, he gave a small nod. My leg hurts real bad, he admitted, the words seeming to cost him greatly. And I think I have a fever, like when Sophie had the flu. I'm sure you do, Thomas said. Already reaching for the satellite phone, he carried on longer excursions into the woods. But we're going to get you help very soon. As he dialed 911, Thomas kept his eyes on the children. The little girl, Sophie, was beginning to stir, perhaps roused by their quiet conversation. Ethan immediately turned his attention to her, whispering reassurances that Thomas couldn't quite catch, but whose intent was clear. Even in his compromised state, the boy's first priority was comforting his sister. The 911 dispatcher answered, and Thomas quickly explained the situation, providing as precise coordinates as he could based on his GPS unit. The dispatcher confirmed what he already suspected. These were the missing children that local authorities had been searching for since yesterday afternoon. Search teams are already being mobilized, the dispatcher informed him. Can you stay with the children until help arrives? Absolutely. I have emergency supplies, water, some food, a first aid kit, and extra clothing. I'll make them as comfortable as possible. Medical personnel will be dispatched immediately. Can you describe the boy's condition in more detail? Thomas gave a thorough assessment of what he could observe. Ethan's obvious fever, the swollen leg that was almost certainly infected, the signs of dehydration and exposure. He kept his voice low, but Ethan was watching him with an unsettling intensity, clearly aware that he was being discussed. By the time Thomas ended the call, Sophie was fully awake, her green eyes wide with fear as she took in the stranger kneeling at the edge of their shelter. She immediately pressed closer to Ethan, one small hand clutching his shirt. It's okay, sunshine, Ethan murmured. This is Mr. Thomas. He's going to help us. Thomas was struck by the trust implicit in those words. After what these children had experienced, abandoned by their foster father, struggling to survive for days in the wilderness, Ethan's willingness to believe in the kindness of another adult was nothing short of remarkable. Hi, Sophie, Thomas said, keeping his voice gentle. I bet you're hungry and thirsty, aren't you? I have some water and snacks in my backpack. He moved slowly, telegraphing his actions as he unslung his backpack and withdrew a water bottle and several protein bars. He handed them to Ethan first, letting the boy perform the familiar role of provider by giving them to his sister. Sophie took the protein bar with a combination of eagerness and suspicion, her eyes darting between Thomas and Ethan as if seeking permission. When Ethan nodded, she tore into the wrapper, devouring the bar with the desperate hunger of a child who hadn't had a proper meal in days. "Help is on the way," Thomas told them as they ate and drank. "There are lots of people looking for you. They'll be here soon to take you somewhere warm and safe." "Are they going to send us back to Mr. Victor?" Sophie asked, her voice small and frightened. "No," Thomas said firmly, not caring if it was a promise he could technically keep. "You will never have to go back to him." Ever this seemed to satisfy both children. Ethan visibly relaxed, some of the tension leaving his thin shoulders. But the relief was short-lived as another wave of fever clearly hit him. His eyes lost focus, and he swayed slightly where he sat. Thomas knew he needed to take more direct action. The boy's condition was deteriorating, and while help was on the way, it might not arrive quickly enough. The infection in the broken leg needed immediate attention. "Ethan," he said, moving closer, "I'd like to look at your leg if that's okay. I have a first aid kit and I've had some training. I might be able to make it feel a little better until the doctors get here." Ethan hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay." Moving carefully, Thomas gently unwrapped the filthy dish towel from around Ethan's lower leg. What he found beneath made him have to work hard to keep his expression neutral. The leg was grossly swollen, the skin hot and tight with infection. There was an obvious deformity where the bones had been broken and then left to heal improperly. "You've been carrying this injury for a while," Thomas said, keeping his voice conversational as he rummaged in his first aid kit for alcohol wipes and clean gauze. "For days before we came to the forest," Ethan confirmed. "Mr. Victor kicked me when I tried to stop him from hurting their dog." The matter-of-fact delivery of such a horrific statement made Thomas's chest tighten with anger. But he focused on the task at hand, gently cleaning around the worst of the infection, avoiding direct pressure on the obviously broken bones. "This is going to sting," he warned before applying antiseptic to the area. Ethan flinched but made no sound, his jaw clenched tight against the pain. Thomas wrapped the leg loosely in clean gauze, creating a makeshift splint from a foam pad from his backpack to take some of the pressure off. "That should feel a little better," he said when he was done. "The most important thing now is to get you to a hospital where they can give you medicine for the infection and fix your leg properly." Ethan touched the clean bandage with cautious fingers. "It does feel better." "Thank you, you're welcome." Thomas turned his attention to Sophie, giving her a gentle once-over. She showed no obvious injuries beyond minor scrapes and scratches, but she was clearly exhausted and somewhat dehydrated. "How about you, Sophie? Are you hurt anywhere?" She shook her head, then held up her palm to show a small cut. "Just here from yesterday." "May I?" Thomas asked, and when she nodded, he gently cleaned and bandaged the small wound. "They're good as new." With immediate medical concerns addressed as best he could manage in the field, Thomas turned to making the children more comfortable. He pulled emergency thermal blankets from his pack, wrapping one around each child. From a small stuff sack, he produced a set of hand warmers, activating them with a squeeze and tucking them into the blankets. "These will help keep you warm," he explained. "They're like little heaters." Sophie's eyes widened as the packet began to warm in her hands. "It's magic." "Kind of," Thomas agreed with a smile. "Special chemicals that make heat when they mix together," as they waited for rescue. Thomas kept the children engaged, asking questions about their favorite foods and colors, telling carefully edited stories about fish he'd caught in these waters. He was deliberately avoiding asking more about their situation. That would be for the professionals. His job now was simply to keep them calm and stable until help arrived. Ethan's condition, despite the clean bandage and the warmth of the thermal blanket, seemed to be worsening. He would respond to direct questions, but his answers became increasingly disjointed. Twice, Thomas had to steady him when he began to list to one side. Sophie noticed, her small face creased with worry. "Ethan's really sick," she whispered to Thomas as if sharing a secret. "He carried me yesterday when I couldn't walk anymore." Even though his leg hurt, the simple statement painted a vivid picture for Thomas. This small injured boy somehow finding the strength to carry his sister through miles of difficult terrain, all while suffering from a broken leg and developing infection. The courage it must have taken was almost beyond comprehension. "Your brother is very brave," Thomas told her. "And so are you." Dawn was breaking now, pale light filtering through the pine branches. With it came the distant but unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Thomas immediately pulled a bright orange emergency flag from his pack and stood. "I'm going to go a little way into that clearing," he told the children, pointing to an open space about 50 yards away. "I need to signal the helicopter so they can find us. I'll be right back. I promise." Ethan gave a feeble nod, and Sophie looked anxious but didn't protest. Thomas hurried to the clearing, unfurling the orange flag and waving it in broad sweeps above his head. The helicopter appeared moments later, circling once before hovering directly overhead. A crewman leaned out, spotting Thomas and giving a thumbs up to indicate they'd been seen. The helicopter couldn't land in the dense forest, but it circled overhead, clearly marking their position for the ground teams that must be en route. Thomas returned to the children, finding Sophie pressed tightly against Ethan's side, her hands covering her ears against the noise of the rotors. "That's our rescue helicopter," Thomas explained, kneeling beside them again. "They're letting the people on the ground know exactly where we are. The rescue team will be here very soon." As if on cue, shouts could be heard in the distance, voices calling back and forth as the search team made their way along the trail toward their position. Thomas answered with a loud hello, guiding them in. Within minutes, the first rescuers broke through the trees, 2 paramedics and a state police officer, all wearing the distinctive orange vests of the search and rescue team. They moved quickly to the children, the paramedics immediately beginning to assess Ethan's condition while the officer conferred quietly with Thomas. "Allison Reynolds confessed yesterday afternoon," the officer explained in hushed tones. "Her husband took the kids on a special trip and came back without them, claiming he'd left them with family friends in a remote cabin. She was too afraid of him to call immediately. But when he took off with their savings, she finally contacted us." "What kind of monster dumps children in the wilderness?" Thomas asked, the anger he'd been suppressing finally showing through. "The kind we're going to catch," the officer assured him grimly. "There's an APB out for Victor Reynolds across 4 states. He won't get far." Their conversation was interrupted by activity from the paramedics. One was speaking urgently into a radio, requesting immediate evacuation for the boy. Suspected sepsis from untreated compound fracture. Temperature 1043. Tachycardic. Need immediate transport to Portland. Memorial. Events began to move quickly. More rescue personnel arrived, including 2 wilderness EMTs with a specialized stretcher designed for rough terrain evacuation. Ethan was carefully transferred onto it, the paramedics starting in 4-line to begin administering fluids and antibiotics. Through it all, Sophie refused to leave her brother's side, becoming increasingly distressed when one of the EMTs tried to lead her away to be examined separately. "No, I need to stay with Ethan. He needs me," she cried, tears streaming down her face. Ethan, despite his semi-conscious state, seemed to sense her distress. His left hand moved restlessly on the stretcher, searching. "Sophie," he called, his voice weak but urgent. Thomas stepped in, kneeling beside the stretcher. "Ethan, they need to take you to the hospital right away. Sophie will be right behind you, I promise. But you need to go first because your leg needs special medicine." Ethan's fever-bright eyes found Thomas's. "You'll stay with her until she comes to the hospital too?" "I will," Thomas promised without hesitation. "I won't leave her side until she's with you again." This seemed to satisfy Ethan, though whether he truly comprehended in his fevered state was unclear. The EMTs seized the moment to begin moving, carefully maneuvering the stretcher through the trees toward a clearing large enough for the helicopter to lower a rescue basket. Thomas lifted Sophie into his arms, feeling her small body trembling as she watched her brother being carried away. "They're going to make him better," he assured her. "And we'll follow just as soon as the doctor checks you too. Okay?" Sophie nodded against his shoulder, her arms tight around his neck. "Promise." "I promise." The extraction went as smoothly as could be expected in the difficult terrain. Ethan was airlifted first, the helicopter disappearing toward Portland with its precious cargo, and a paramedic who continued treatment during transit. Sophie, after a brief examination that found her suffering from mild dehydration and exhaustion but otherwise remarkably healthy, was loaded into a waiting ambulance with Thomas at her side, keeping his promise to stay with her. As the ambulance wound its way out of the forest on rough service roads, Sophie finally surrendered to the exhaustion she'd been fighting. She fell asleep against Thomas's side, her small hand still clutching his as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Looking down at her, Thomas felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. He'd gone into the woods that morning expecting nothing more exciting than checking his fishing gear. Instead, he'd become entangled in the lives of these two remarkable children who had survived against incredible odds. "We've got a police escort meeting us at the main road," the EMT in the back of the ambulance told him quietly. "They'll get us to Portland Memorial in record time." Thomas nodded, his hand gently stroking Sophie's tangled hair. "How's the boy, Ethan? Any word?" "First report from the chopper says he's holding steady. They're pushing antibiotics and fluids, keeping his temperature from climbing higher. Kid's a fighter." "You have no idea," Thomas murmured, thinking of what these children had endured. Not just the 3 days in the wilderness, but the abuse that had preceded it, the broken leg inflicted by someone who should have been their protector. By mid-morning, they were pulling up to the emergency entrance of Portland Memorial Hospital, where a team of medical personnel waited to receive Sophie. Despite his status as a non-relative, Thomas was allowed to stay with her due to her extreme distress whenever anyone suggested he leave. "Ethan," she kept saying, looking around anxiously as they wheeled her into a treatment room. "Where's Ethan?" "He's here in the hospital," a kind-faced nurse assured her. "The doctors are fixing his leg and giving him medicine. As soon as they're done, you can see him." This seemed to calm her somewhat, though she still insisted on holding Thomas's hand throughout her examination. The doctor, a pediatric specialist named Dr. Monroe, was gentle and patient, explaining each step of the examination before proceeding. "You're a very brave girl, Sophie," Dr. Monroe said when she'd finished. "You're a little dehydrated, which means you need more water in your body, and you have some scratches and bruises, but overall you're in remarkably good shape for someone who spent 3 days in the woods." "Ethan took care of me," Sophie said simply, as if that explained everything. "And perhaps it did." "Well, now it's our turn to take care of both of you," Dr. Monroe replied with a smile. "We're going to start in 4. That's a small tube that will give your body the fluids it needs, and then you can rest. When you wake up, maybe you can see your brother." The mention of seeing Ethan was enough to secure Sophie's cooperation with the 4 placement and the other minor medical interventions required. Soon she was settled in a pediatric room, clean and dressed in hospital pajamas decorated with cartoon animals, her eyes growing heavy as the combination of a full stomach, warmth, and medication began to take effect. "Don't leave," she murmured to Thomas as she drifted towards sleep. "Promise." "I promise," he said again, settling into the chair beside her bed. "I'll be right here." As Sophie slept, Thomas was joined by a social worker named Rachel Winters, who explained that she'd been assigned to the children's case on an emergency basis. "We've been in contact with their previous social worker," she told Thomas quietly. "The children have been in foster care for just over 2 years since their mother's death from an overdose. They've been moved several times due to various issues with placements. The Reynolds were their 5th foster home, and no one noticed anything wrong." Thomas couldn't keep the edge from his voice. "Ethan said his leg was broken 4 days before they were abandoned. That's a pretty big problem to miss." Rachel sighed, looking genuinely troubled. "The Reynolds passed all the standard screenings. Victor Reynolds had no criminal record, good references, stable employment. They had a home visit just 2 weeks ago, and everything seemed fine. The children didn't report any problems." According to Allison Reynolds' statement, Thomas pointed out, Victor convinced her to keep the injury hidden, to tell the boy it was just a sprain. She's cooperating fully now, providing details about Victor's behavior and his statements after abandoning the children. Rachel's expression hardened slightly. "She'll likely face charges for failing to seek medical attention for Ethan and for not reporting the abandonment immediately, though her cooperation may mitigate the sentence." And Victor is still at large, but it's just a matter of time. His photo and description have been distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the Northwest. He used a credit card in Seattle yesterday, so we know he's heading north. Their conversation was interrupted by a doctor entering the room, his scrubs identifying him as a member of the surgical team. He glanced at the sleeping Sophie before addressing them in a low voice. "I'm Dr. Lawson, one of the orthopedic surgeons who worked on Ethan Mitchell. I understand you're the fisherman who found them." This was directed at Thomas, who nodded. "I wanted to update you since you've been with the little girl. Ethan is out of surgery. We had to reset the broken bones, a tibia and fibula fracture, and clean out a significant infection. He's receiving high doses of antibiotics and will remain in the PICU for at least 24 to 48 hours for monitoring. But he'll be okay," Thomas asked, voicing the question that mattered most. Dr. Lawson's expression was cautiously optimistic. "Barring complications, yes. He's young, which works in his favor. The infection was severe, but we caught it before it progressed to systemic sepsis. He'll need several weeks in a cast, possibly some physical therapy afterward, but we expect a full recovery." The relief Thomas felt was profound, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. "Can Sophie see him when she wakes up? She's been incredibly worried. Brief visits should be possible once he's fully awake." Dr. Lawson agreed. "I'll make a note in his chart. It might actually help his recovery to see that his sister is safe and well." After the doctor left, Thomas found himself reluctant to leave. Even though Sophie was sleeping peacefully and would likely continue to do so for several hours, something about these children had gotten under his skin, had awakened a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. "You've gone above and beyond," Rachel told him, seeming to sense his thoughts. "Most people would have called for help and moved on once professionals arrived. Instead, you've stayed with them, providing comfort and stability during a traumatic time." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Rachel said firmly. "Not everyone would have. Trust me, I've been in social work for 12 years. What you've done matters." Before Thomas could respond, a soft knock at the door heralded the arrival of a police detective who introduced himself as Detective Ramirez. He asked to speak with Thomas about finding the children, and they stepped into the hallway to avoid disturbing Sophie. Thomas provided a detailed account of how he discovered Ethan and Sophie, including the boys' statements about Victor Reynolds breaking his leg and abandoning them in the woods. The detective took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. "This will be extremely helpful for building the case against Reynolds," Detective Ramirez said when Thomas had finished. "The children's testimony will be crucial as well, but having an adult witness to their condition and Ethan's statements immediately upon rescue adds significant weight." "Have you caught him yet?" Thomas asked. "Not yet, but we're close. He used a credit card again an hour ago at a gas station just outside of Seattle. Local police have been alerted and all transportation hubs are being monitored. It's only a matter of time." As if on cue, the detective's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, a smile spreading across his face. "And it appears that time is now. Reynolds was just apprehended by Washington State Police on I-5. He was heading for the Canadian border." The news should have brought satisfaction, but Thomas found himself thinking only of the two children whose lives had been forever altered by this man's cruelty. "Good," he said simply. "I hope he goes away for a very long time. With the charges he's facing, child endangerment, child abuse, attempted murder, it's virtually certain," the detective assured him. When the detective had gone, Thomas returned to Sophie's room, resuming his seat beside her bed. Rachel had left as well, promising to return later to discuss next steps for the children's care. For now, though, it was just Thomas and the sleeping child, the steady beep of the 4-pump marking the passage of time. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, checking Sophie's vitals and adjusting her 4. Thomas dozed occasionally in the uncomfortable chair but never left, true to his promise. It was late afternoon when Sophie finally stirred, her eyes blinking open with momentary confusion before focusing on Thomas's face. "You stayed," she said, sounding faintly surprised despite his promise. Of course I did. Thomas leaned forward, smiling at her. How are you feeling? Better. Sophie pushed herself to a sitting position, looking around the bright pediatric room with its colorful murals and child-friendly equipment. Where's Ethan? Is he okay? He is, Thomas assured her. The doctors fixed his leg and gave him medicine for the infection. He's resting now just like you were. And guess what? The doctor said you might be able to visit him soon. Sophie's face lit up, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Really? When? Let me check with the nurse, Thomas suggested, pressing the call button beside her bed. And maybe we can find you something to eat too. I bet you're hungry. The nurse who responded confirmed that Sophie could visit her brother once she'd eaten, and Dr. Monroe had checked her again. She brought a tray of food, simple, easily digestible items like applesauce, toast, and diluted juice, that Sophie attacked with the enthusiasm of a child who had survived on foraged berries and creek water for 3 days. Dr. Monroe arrived as Sophie was finishing her meal, conducting a quick examination and pronouncing herself satisfied with Sophie's improvement. Your brother is awake and asking for you, she told Sophie with a smile. Would you like to see him now? Sophie nodded eagerly, already pushing aside her tray and attempting to climb out of bed. Dr. Monroe laughed gently, helping her with the four. Just a short visit, the doctor cautioned. Ethan needs lots of rest to get better, but I think seeing you will be the best medicine for him right now. They made their way to the pediatric intensive care unit where Ethan had been moved after surgery. Before entering, Dr. Monroe knelt to Sophie's level. Your brother has a lot of tubes and machines helping him get better, she explained gently. It might look a little scary, but everything is there to help him. His leg is in a special cast to hold the bones in place while they heal, and he has medicine going into his arm through and for, just like you do. Sophie nodded, her expression serious. I won't be scared. I just want to see Ethan. The scene inside the PICU was indeed intimidating. Ethan lay in a hospital bed that seemed too large for his small frame, his right leg encased in a bright green cast and elevated on a pillow. Multiple 4 lines ran into his left arm, monitors beeping steadily beside him. But none of that seemed to matter to Sophie, who had eyes only for her brother's face. Ethan, she called, hurrying forward as quickly as her 4-pole would allow. Ethan's eyes, which had been closed, opened immediately at the sound of her voice. His face was still flushed with the remnants of fever, but his gaze was clearer now, the worst of the infection beaten back by powerful antibiotics. Sunshine, he said, his voice weak but filled with relief. You're okay. Aha. And you're getting better too. The doctor fixed your leg. Ethan's eyes moved from Sophie to Thomas, who stood behind her, and then to Dr. Monroe. Thank you, he said simply, the 2 words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't articulate. You did an amazing job taking care of your sister, Ethan, Dr. Monroe told him. But now it's our turn to take care of you. Both of you. Ethan seemed to consider this, his gaze returning to Sophie as if assuring himself that she was truly safe and well. Then he looked back at Thomas. You kept your promise, he said. You stayed with her. I did, Thomas confirmed, moved by the boy's concern for his sister even in his own distress. And I'll keep staying as long as you both need me to. It was a spontaneous offer, one Thomas hadn't planned to make, but found he meant with absolute sincerity. These children, who had survived so much with so little help, had awakened something in him. A desire to protect, to provide the stability they so desperately deserved. Ethan smiled faintly, clearly exhausted by even this brief interaction. Dr. Monroe noted his fatigue and gently suggested that Sophie should let her brother rest. You can visit again tomorrow, she promised. Ethan needs to sleep now so the medicine can help him get better faster. Sophie was reluctant to leave but eventually agreed when Ethan himself told her to go. I'll see you tomorrow, Sunshine, he assured her. I'm not going anywhere. As they turned to leave, Ethan called out once more, Mr. Thomas? Thomas paused, turning back. Yes, Ethan? Did they catch him? Mr. Victor? The question hung in the air, loaded with all the fear and uncertainty the children had lived with. Thomas exchanged a glance with Dr. Monroe, who gave a small nod. Yes, Thomas said firmly. They caught him. He's in jail and he's going to stay there for a very long time. He can never hurt you or Sophie again. Ethan digested this information, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a single decisive nod as if closing a chapter. Good, he said and closed his eyes, surrendering to the healing sleep his body so desperately needed. Back in Sophie's room, Thomas found Rachel Winters waiting with news. I've been making calls about the children's case, she explained once Sophie was settled back in bed with a coloring book and crayons provided by a volunteer. There's something I'd like to discuss with you if you have a moment. They stepped into the hallway, Rachel's expression both serious and hopeful. The children's previous placements were all foster homes without the intention to adopt, she began. As is often the case with older children and sibling groups, finding a permanent placement has been challenging. But given the extraordinary circumstances and the media attention this case has received, I've been inundated with calls from potential foster families willing to take both children, including several who are open to adoption. Thomas felt a curious mix of emotions at this news. Relief that the children would have options, but also an unexpected pang at the thought of them moving on, away from him. That's good, he said, trying to focus on what was best for Ethan and Sophie rather than his own strange reluctance to let them go. They deserve a stable home. Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. You formed a bond with these children, she observed, especially with Sophie. It's not unusual in rescue situations, particularly ones as emotionally charged as this. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, unused to having his feelings so accurately read by a stranger. They're special kids. They are, Rachel agreed. Which is why I want to suggest something that might seem unorthodox. Would you consider becoming a temporary foster placement for them once they're released from the hospital? The question caught Thomas completely off guard. Me? But I'm not. You're not a certified foster parent, Rachel acknowledged. But there are provisions for emergency kinship placements in extraordinary circumstances, which these certainly qualify as. We could expedite the process, conduct the necessary home study and background checks on an accelerated timeline. But I'm not family, Thomas pointed out, still struggling to process the suggestion. You're the closest thing these children have to a trusted adult figure right now, Rachel countered. You found them. You stayed with them through the rescue and hospital admission. You've kept your promises to them. That matters, especially to children who have experienced the kind of betrayal they have. Thomas's mind raced, considering the implications. He lived alone in a comfortable 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, left to him by his parents. He'd been a bachelor all his life, his job as a fisheries consultant for the state allowing him a flexible schedule but modest income. He had no experience with children beyond occasionally spending time with his sister's kids. And yet, the image of Ethan and Sophie huddled beneath that pine tree, having survived against impossible odds through nothing but Ethan's determination and courage, had etched itself into Thomas's heart. The way Sophie's small hand had sought his for comfort. The way Ethan had fought to stay conscious until he knew his sister was safe. These things had changed something fundamental within him. I'd need to think about it, he said finally. This isn't a decision to make lightly. Rachel nodded, seemingly pleased rather than disappointed by his caution. Of course, take the time you need. The children will be in the hospital for at least a few more days, Ethan longer than Sophie most likely, but I wanted to present the option now so we can begin the process if you decide it's something you're willing to consider. Before Thomas could respond further, a nurse approached with an update on Ethan's condition. His fever's broken, she reported with a smile. The antibiotics are working. Dr. Lawson says he's cautiously optimistic about a full recovery. Though it will take time, the news sent a wave of relief through Thomas. He thanked the nurse, then turned back to Rachel. I'd like to visit him if that's allowed, of course. I'll stay with Sophie. Rachel gestured toward the door of the little girl's room, where Sophie could be seen through the window, still focused on her coloring. She seems quite comfortable with the activities the child life specialist brought. Thomas made his way back to the PICU, where he found Ethan awake, his color markedly improved from their earlier visit. The boy's eyes tracked to him immediately as he entered. "Mr. Thomas?" Ethan said, a faint smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "You came back." "I did," Thomas confirmed, moving to stand beside the bed. "I hear you're feeling better." Ethan nodded slightly, careful not to disturb the various tubes and wires connected to him. "The medicine is helping. My leg doesn't hurt as much now." "That's good to hear." There was a moment of silence, not uncomfortable but full of unspoken emotions. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice smaller, more vulnerable than before. "What's going to happen to us now, to me and Sophie?" The question hit Thomas with surprising force. Of course, the boy would be concerned about their future, would be wondering what new uncertainty awaited them after the hospital. Despite all they'd been through, Ethan was still thinking ahead, still focused on protecting his sister. "Well," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully, "there are a lot of people who want to help you and Sophie. Ms. Winters, the social worker you met earlier, is looking at options for where you'll go when you leave the hospital." Ethan's expression tightened slightly, a shadow of fear crossing his face. "Will they keep us together, me and Sophie?" "Absolutely," Thomas assured him with a conviction he felt down to his bones. "No one is going to separate you two. Not after everything you've been through together." Some of the tension left Ethan's body at this promise. "Good," he said simply. Then, after a moment, "I like Ms. Winters. She doesn't talk to us like we're babies." "She seems like a good person," Thomas agreed. "She really wants to find the best place for you both." Another silence fell, this one more contemplative. Ethan seemed to be considering something, his young face serious beyond his years. "Mr. Thomas," he finally said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Anything. Do you have kids?" The question was unexpected, and Thomas found himself smiling at the directness of it. "No, I don't. I never got married or had a family of my own." "Oh." Ethan absorbed this information, his expression thoughtful. "But you're good with kids. You knew how to make Sophie feel better when she was scared." "Well, thank you," Thomas said, touched by the observation. "I have nieces and nephews, my sister's children, that I spend time with, and I've worked with the search and rescue team for many years, helping people who are lost or hurt." Ethan nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "You'd be a good dad," he stated with the simple certainty of a child. The words landed with unexpected weight. Before Thomas could formulate a response, Ethan continued, his voice taking on a tentative quality. "Ms. Winters said we might go to a new foster home when we leave the hospital. One where people want to adopt kids. That's one possibility," Thomas acknowledged, watching the boy carefully. "What if—" Ethan hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. "What if we stayed with you instead, just until they find us a forever home?" The question, so close to what Rachel had proposed just minutes earlier, left Thomas momentarily speechless. That this child, who had every reason to distrust adults after what he'd endured, would ask to stay with him was both humbling and profoundly moving. "Is that something you'd want?" Thomas asked when he found his voice again. "To stay with me for a while?" Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "Sophie likes you, and you kept your promise to stay with her. And you found us in the woods when nobody else could." He paused, then added with that same direct simplicity, "I trust you." 3 simple words that carried the weight of a lifetime. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a decision crystallizing where before there had been only uncertainty. "I'd need to talk to Ms. Winters about it," he said carefully. "There are rules about these things, procedures that have to be followed. But if it's possible, yes, I'd like for you and Sophie to stay with me while you're recovering." A smile, small but genuine, spread across Ethan's face. "Really? Really?" Thomas confirmed, finding that the idea, rather than frightening him as it perhaps should have, filled him with a sense of rightness. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, you need to focus on getting better." Ethan nodded, clearly satisfied with this answer. "I will. The doctor said if I rest and take all the medicine, I might go home next week." Home, the word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a nurse coming to check Ethan's vitals and administer the next round of antibiotics. Thomas used the opportunity to take his leave, promising to return later with Sophie for another brief visit if the doctors allowed it. As he walked back towards Sophie's room, his mind was already racing through the practical considerations. The spare bedrooms that would need to be furnished, the arrangements he'd need to make with his work, the countless adjustments that would be required to welcome two traumatized children into his life, even temporarily. Yet underlying all these thoughts was a sense of certainty that had been missing from his life for longer than he cared to admit. For years, he'd lived alone, his days filled with meaningful work, but his home empty of the deeper connections that gave life its fullest meaning. Now, in the most unexpected way imaginable, he'd been offered a chance to change that. He found Rachel still sitting with Sophie, the two of them engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation about the relative merits of purple versus blue crayons for coloring the sky. The social worker looked up as he entered, a question in her eyes. "Can we talk?" Thomas asked quietly. "I've made a decision," Rachel nodded, excusing herself to Sophie with a promise to continue their artistic debate later. In the hallway, Thomas didn't waste time with preamble. "I want to do it," he said simply. "I want to provide a home for Ethan and Sophie, at least temporarily. What do we need to do to make that happen?" Rachel's face broke into a genuine smile. "I had a feeling you might say that. Ethan asked me about the possibility just before you arrived to take Sophie to see him." "He asked me just now," Thomas admitted. "That's what made up my mind." "Then let's get started," Rachel said, her professional demeanor returning, though the warmth remained in her eyes. "We'll need to conduct an expedited home study, background checks, and complete some emergency certification training. It's an accelerated process but still thorough." As Rachel outlined the steps that would follow, Thomas felt a curious mixture of nervousness and anticipation. His life was about to change dramatically in ways he couldn't fully anticipate. There would be challenges, certainly, helping two traumatized children heal, navigating the foster care system, and potentially preparing them for an eventual transition to a permanent adoptive home. But there would also be moments of joy, of connection, of the simple human comfort that comes from being needed and from meeting that need with a steady presence. Already, he could envision evenings reading stories, weekends exploring the gentler parts of the forest that had nearly claimed their lives, and holidays filled with new traditions created together. Whether this arrangement lasted weeks, months, or evolved into something more permanent, Thomas knew with certainty that he was making the right choice. For Ethan and Sophie, yes, but also for himself. Later that evening, after completing the initial paperwork with Rachel and making arrangements to begin the expedited certification process the following day, Thomas returned to Sophie's room to find her sitting up in bed, engaged in a serious conversation with a stuffed dolphin that one of the nurses had brought her. "Mr. Splash says he's hungry," she informed Thomas gravely as he entered. "But the nurse said dinner isn't until 6 o'clock. "Well, that is a problem," Thomas agreed, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Perhaps Mr. Splash could have a snack to tide him over. I happen to have some crackers in my backpack." Sophie's face lit up. "Yes, please. Mr. Splash would like that very much." As Thomas retrieved the crackers from his pack, he thought about how quickly children could adapt, finding moments of normality and even joy in the midst of trauma. Sophie, despite everything she'd endured, was still capable of imaginative play, of caring for a stuffed animal, of accepting kindness from those around her. Ethan, too, had shown remarkable resilience. His unwavering protection of his sister, his determination to survive against overwhelming odds, his capacity to trust despite having that trust shattered by those meant to care for him. These were children worth fighting for, worth rearranging a life for. And Thomas, somewhat to his own surprise, found himself eager to begin. "Sophie," he said as she carefully fed a cracker to Mr. Splash, "I was wondering how you'd feel about coming to stay at my house when the doctors say you can leave the hospital. You and Ethan, once he's well enough." Sophie looked up at him, her green eyes wide with surprise and cautious hope. "Your house? Like to live there for a while?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "I have 2 empty bedrooms that are just waiting for someone to use them, and a backyard with a big maple tree that would be perfect for a swing." "A swing," Sophie repeated, clearly captivated by this detail. "Like at a park." "Exactly like that. And there's a creek nearby, a safe one, with a little wooden bridge where we could look for frogs in the summer. Sophie considered this, her young face surprisingly thoughtful. Would Ethan have his own room too? He would, Thomas assured her. Right next to yours, and you could decorate them however you like. Choose the colors for the walls, pick out bedspreads, all of that. Another careful consideration. Then the question that revealed where her true concerns lay. Would you be there too? All the time? I would, Thomas promised. Every day and every night. I work from home most days, so I'd be there when you woke up in the morning and when you went to bed at night. This seemed to satisfy her most pressing concern. And no one would hurt Ethan again or take us to the forest. The question broke Thomas's heart even as it strengthened his resolve.
No, Sophie.
No one will ever hurt either of you in my home. And the only times we'd go to the woods would be together for fun things, like picnics or looking for interesting rocks or watching birds. And we'd always come back home afterward. Sophie nodded solemnly, as if committing this promise to memory. Then she extended Mr. Splash toward Thomas. Mr. Splash says yes, she announced, and I say yes too. Thomas accepted the stuffed animal with appropriate gravity. Thank you, Mr. Splash. And thank you, Sophie. I think we're going to be just fine together. As he said the words, he realized he believed them completely. The road ahead would not be without its challenges, but they would face them together. Thomas, Ethan, Sophie, and Mr. Splash too. A makeshift family forged in the most unlikely of circumstances, bound by shared experience and growing trust. In the pediatric ward, Ethan Mitchell slept peacefully for the first time in days, his broken leg properly set and healing, the infection retreating before the onslaught of modern medicine. In another room, Sophie Mitchell fed crackers to a stuffed dolphin and contemplated a future that included swings and frogs and safety. And Thomas Bennett, who had gone into the woods that morning as a solitary fisherman, would emerge from this experience as something entirely different, beginning to mentally transform his house into a home for two children who had carried the burden of courage for far too long. Victor Reynolds sat in a holding cell in a Washington State police barracks, his face impassive as charges were read that would ensure he spent decades behind bars. Allison Reynolds cooperated with investigators, providing evidence against her husband while facing her own lesser charges for her failure to act sooner. And somewhere, perhaps the spirit of a young mother who had loved her children, even as addiction pulled her away from them, found peace in knowing that her son had kept his promise to protect his sister, and that both her children had finally found a safe harbor after years of storms. The burden of courage had been lifted. In its place came words of healing, of promise, of possibility, and the first tentative foundations of what might, with time, patience, and love, become a family.